Hey everybody, welcome back to Engaging the Phenomenon. And today we have a special guest with us, Courtney Marchesani, and she is the author of an upcoming BICS paper, the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies. The name of the paper is called Language of Consciousness, Signs, Symbols, and Messages from the Afterlife. And she's also written a book um, called Four Gifts of the Highly Sensitive. So welcome, Courtney.
Hi, James. Thanks for having me. I'm excited about our talk. It's going to be fun.
Yes, definitely. And pronounce your name again, just so people know.
Marchesani, Courtney
Marcasani.
Marchesani.
There
The
we go.
CH is hard because it's in Italian, so it sounds like Chianti. That's how I
Yeah.
associate it.
So, you've done a lot of interesting work. Um, and you wrote this people will know that BICS, the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies, had recently announced, or a few months ago, announced a contest that they were doing about people submitting papers for consciousness in the afterlife. Um, and you submitted a paper that was accepted. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the contest was announced in January, and it was sent to me by Grant Cameron. So that's how I found out about it. He said, "Heads up, this looks like it might be in your wheelhouse." And so I looked at the requirements, which were pretty, steep requirements, and I fit into what they were looking for. You had to be researching afterlife concepts. You'd have to be in one of the big foundations or one of the big nonprofit organizations like IANS or the parapsychological, community. And so I fell into that. And so I had been doing that research on consciousness, for a long time, but you have to basically explain that. And so I applied to get into the contest. And they announced in March the people who were basically accepted, and over 1,400 entrants or applicants put in, and only 200 people were accepted. And I was one of the 200 that was accepted. So
Yeah.
the paper was due in August. And then because some of the folks wanted extension on the deadline, which I was happy to have that extension, it was like August 21st. And so the papers went in and were finally submitted. And then the winners are going to be announced next week, actually, November 4th.
Yeah, well, that's very exciting. And I think that your paper was fascinating. Um, and I hope that it makes some of the, I hope it wins. I hope it wins. I'll say that. I
Thanks. Well, you
reading it.
go through a whole range of emotions from like doubting yourself as a writer, doubting your research topic. I mean, I didn't really doubt the passion that I have for the subject of consciousness and afterlife contact because I have been involved and so interested in it. It's a matter of articulating your topic and doing it in a way that makes it feel like it can stand up underneath the scrutiny. And so that's the part that's kind of maddening, but I got it in, under the
Yeah.
deadline, which makes me happy. And I also feel like it was a great reward because you're able to put all of that research and all that work into one project, and that's reward enough to kind of tie up all those years into one coherent topic. And so that was very rewarding. I think that's what BICS really forced me to do, is dig deep and articulate what I've been trying to for so long into one project.
Yeah. So we are going to circle back and talk about the your BICS paper soon.
Okay.
But let's go back and kind of go, and how did you get interested into subjects like consciousness or highly sensitive people or anything like that? Where does that begin for you?
It started in my mid 20s when I had a couple of profound psychic experiences. I wasn't raised in a family or in a community where these kind of experiences were explained or well understood or even identified. And so what happened to me was through my own personal experience, I had a couple of obvious like psychic experiences. And so then I tried to understand what those were. And that was the stepping stone that led me into the field of consciousness and consciousness studies and what consciousness is.
Yeah. And you have terms in your that you use in the paper and in books called like highly sensitive people. So what is that?
I didn't come to highly sensitive people until 20 years later.
Oh, okay, okay.
Okay. But that's the really profound thing, I think, that's so interesting about my personal story versus other people's is that I didn't know any of that terminology. I went to school and got a psychology degree, but it was very much focused on like psychopharmacology, cognitive behavioral therapy. You know, in the 90s, it was the decade of the brain research. So I fell into that where it was all about the body, right? And mental health and counseling. And so the consciousness piece in my own education really wasn't there. I had to figure that out later and tie it into HSP personality because it was part of a calling, I would say, a very strong calling that I had where it was like the psychic experiences is what led me into researching psychic phenomenon. And when those experiences happened in my 20s, I was led to the work of Russell Targ. Russell Targ was part of the SRI research program, and he was doing, he had written a book, and he did a book tour, and he was also doing workshops. So I traveled from Seattle down to meet Russell Targ in San Francisco. And I did one of his workshops, which was basically remote viewing, and had high scores on that and thought, well, this is interesting. So it validated the psychic phenomenon part, but I didn't come to HSP work until much later when I started to make the connection between the experiences I'd been having my whole life to the fact that I was a highly sensitive person. But that didn't come about until much later. And so I tell people I kind of had to reverse engineer the whole sensitivity piece because I didn't identify myself as a highly sensitive person. But once I started to make the interconnections between all these phenomenon, which are totally consciousness related, I started to see how they were intertied into the highly sensitive person archetype. That's the best way to put it. And I know that sounds like, you know, is it the chicken or the egg? But I started to see that highly sensitive people had these patterns in their own consciousness that might have been being overlooked in the research and in the medical terminology. So I'm kind of the person that took these anomalous experiences and said, highly sensitive people have these experiences more often, whether it's through trauma or through birth and genetics. And then I kind of wrote a book about how those come about in the highly sensitive personality through the experiences. And I call them gifted HSPs because they have sensitivity that allows them to have more anomalous experiences. And I kind of break that out in the science and the language so that highly sensitive people who are having anomalous experiences can understand them.
Yeah. And, you know, for people listening, what are some of those anomalous experiences? What might they be?
Well, it's telepathy, psychic experiences or precognitions. It's deep empathy, so feeling the feelings of other people. A lot of times empathy is described as like self to other processing, where it's a first person perspective, but it's of another person's feelings. When you bring sensitivity into the mix and you overlay sensitivity on top of empathy, there are some empaths that are so far out, they don't necessarily distinguish the other person's feelings from their own. There's that lack of distinguishing between, oh, this is mine and this is theirs, because they're such deep empaths. So empathy, and in empathy, there's a range of experiences. And so in my book of the highly sensitive gifts, I talk about the different types of empathy. So there's a compassionate empath, there's a spiritual empath, there's the counselor empath. So I break that out too, of the different types of empathy and how it appears in the highly sensitive person's life. And then there's visionary. So people who have visions, whether they're prophetic or precognitive, that's how it shows up. Also in special talents of being able to take certain types of information in the visual field or the mind's eye to solve problems. That's another way it shows up in the highly sensitive person's life. And then the expressive. So creativity, answers coming through or decision making that are highly creative. I mean, one of the things that has been linked or interlinked between intuition, highly sensitive person, and creative processing is that creative people, especially in the experiencer community, which a lot of your folks who are listening to this might be in the experiencer community, people tend to get the answer before they've even asked the question. And so when you say that, then they go, ah, yeah, I have that happen where I'll get an answer, but I don't know why it's coming in. And then a couple days later, I see. So it's
Yeah.
almost like science is catching up to a lot of these people because they're having these, really profound gifts and abilities happening. And then we're looking to solve for it and understand why those questions are coming about and how they're being answered. It's anomalous cognition.
I love that terminology. And are there crossover between the different categories sometimes?
Yeah, I call it a convergence,
Okay, yeah.
a multi sensory intelligence that converges. And so it could be because somebody is super sensitive when they're a kid, whether it's genetic or it's comes about through a traumatic experience. And so then the sensitivity works in different ways where you see an ability or a talent, and then that individual develops that talent over their life, and that's where they become converged. So you'll see one person be a deep empath, but also very intuitive, and then those will overlap in
Yeah.
interesting and exciting ways. And so you can have somebody who's an empathic visionary or an intuitive empath, or you could have an expressive visionary. And so that's what I look at as kind of quantifying how sensory information comes in through that anomalous cognition for the sensitive person, how it looks like and feels to them. That's kind of one of the things that I talk about in the BICS paper is how to quantify, I call it a language, that
Yeah.
language that they perceive and then how they use it in their life to solve problems or, find their partner or, their community. It's a very fascinating multiple types of abilities, right?
Yeah. And you mentioned you had some experiences. What are some of those experiences that occurred for you?
The first experience that ever happened that just was like a head turner was my stuff came about through dreams first. So that's what piqued my interest. I was living in Missoula, going to my undergraduate school, the U of M in psychology. I was pretty young, but I was married and had a child, right?
Yeah.
So I was still young, but also doing a lot of mature things in my life. And my husband at the time, my ex husband, was involved with some pretty shady people. And I had a dream about one of them. And he was a dealer, essentially. And so I didn't know how involved. I mean, to me, he was just an acquaintance, somebody who I knew who was a friend of my husband. I had a dream where I saw him drive through a stop sign, crash through it. The cops came, they opened up the trunk, and he had marijuana, cocaine, guns. I mean, just an array of illegal,
Yeah.
illicit activity in one compartment.
Yeah.
It wasn't funny at the time though. During the dream, it really was like taking that perspective of watching it play out. And so, in addition to that, I saw him in a courtroom in the dream now with his hands behind his back in front of the judge, and he was being sentenced. And so I woke up from the dream and I was like, I was like, oh my gosh, it was such a lucid, vivid imagery of what was going to happen or what was to come that I woke up, I shook him and I woke him up and I said, this is bad. You need to stay away from this guy. And at the time, I'm sure he was just trying to like allay my fears, but he was like, you're just being paranoid. I'm just an acquaintance with that guy. I don't have some big relationship with him. So, like, I'm saying 6 months later, we saw him on the nightly news in Missoula, on the 11 o'clock news, with his hands behind his back in front of the judge being sentenced. And
Yeah.
it was like exact,
Yeah.
from the dream. And so that's what made me go, okay, there's something else. But then nothing, right? Like I just put it away as some kind of weird experience that happened that I tried to understand and that maybe it was a one time thing, but it wasn't a one time thing. That was like my first inkling that there was something else happening under the surface. But for me, it came through like dream lucidity and dream intuition first.
Yeah. And that's I guess we can call that precognition in a sense.
It was the part of the courthouse was completely precogged. Like it was exact. I think that's
Yeah.
pretty rare. I think that's a pretty rare experience for intuitives. But for me, that's the way it came through. But then it became kind of a whole series of events that stemmed from that type of intuition that made me go, what's going on with this? And then it became a passion when I kind of had a life. I mean, you could say that that experience was life transforming. It was traumatic in a way because my ex-husband was actually deeply connected with that guy. And it led to all the criminal activity that my ex-husband was involved in. And so it actually was profound. I just didn't recognize it at the time as being as profound as it was. But other things happened afterward that I thought were really extremely exaggerated that made me think, okay, I need to figure out what this is. Why is this happening? Why am I different? And I became passionate about understanding the dynamics of why those things were happening. Because the other thing that happened was I prevented a fire in Seattle. So after we graduated from Missoula, from the University of Montana, we both graduated out of the site program. We moved to Washington. And in Washington, that's when things just really accelerated in terms of the intuition. And so I prevented a fire in an apartment building, and that was life transforming. And it was precognition, and it was intuition, and it was a different type of intuition. And the best way I can describe it is that profound ability of the lucid dreaming at night was tipping over into the daytime, where the intuition was revealing itself through my consciousness in my waking hours. That's the best way that I can define it.
Yeah, because I think for a lot of people, you have an experience like that, and there's no place to put it really. So, it's just kind of like you're going on with your life as it comes, and that's a
Mm-hmm.
really interesting thing. And sometimes, but again, yeah, sometimes you have one that's just so profound that it almost shatters your paradigm,
Yeah.
and when that happens, you're like, you need to know now. I feel that happens with a lot of people that have these kind of profound experiences, whether it be psychic phenomenon, an awakening experience, although that is an awakening of a sort as well, UAP experiences and contact too.
Yeah. So I didn't connect the dots on the UAP stuff until later. So the fire prevention happened in the early 2000s. And after I prevented the fire in the apartment building, I didn't know what it was. I heard a voice. I went to pick up my girlfriend. She had her two young boys. I had my young daughter at the time, but she was with her dad that weekend. But I had agreed to help her out, and we were going to move a bed from another friend's apartment complex. And I went and I picked her up. I had a truck, and I heard when I picked her and her boys up, don't move the bed, which was like our sole mission that night, was to move the bed, right?
Yeah.
And so I never went up into her apartment, but I heard that voice and I recognized it immediately, but I didn't know what it was. But I also had a sickening feeling, like it was a nagging, like a gut feeling to not move the bed. Like I didn't listen to it. I heard it. We went to go do the bed. It took us driving all the way across for Seattle that night and hearing it and having it get louder and louder for me to go, okay, I need to listen to this, whatever it is. I don't know why. And so midway of like taking apart this bed at our other friend's apartment, I just looked at my friend and I said, we need to leave and go back. And she was like, we're halfway done, like
Yeah.
you're crazy. And so I just kind of enforced my will and like, we're going back now. So I get her and her kids back in my truck and we drive all the way across Seattle. And she thinks I'm crazy, but I'm just compelled. And we got up into her apartment and we went in and there was a layer of smoke in the second floor hallway. And it was coming from her apartment. So once we got in, we realized she left a 3-wick candle burning on the
Yeah.
windowsill. And it was just the candle burning and the wax had gone down on the floor. And for a river of wax, there was a bamboo shade over the windowsill that was black and it was smoking and it had filled up the whole hallway and the whole apartment complex. So it was about ready to burn the building down. And we got there
Yeah.
just in the nick of time. And so when that happened and we got back there and it was just on pure intuition alone, I was totally transformed. It's what you just mentioned. It's like it shatters everything. You might have had a couple of intuitions before, or maybe a couple of precognitive dreams, but when something that like that happens in material reality, it's earth shaking. And so for me it was. And then I tried to like reach out to other people and say, have you had these experiences before? And most people really hadn't. And so then I kind of felt alone with it, but I just kept researching it. And that's how I found Russell Targ's book. After that Prevention of the Fire, I went, I'm going to figure out what this is. And so I went to a local used bookstore and I found Miracles of Mind. And I read Miracles of Mind and I was like, this makes sense to me. Because he talked about SRI research. He talked about remote viewing. He talked about perceiving emotional events, which I had had that experience too with the precognitive dreams that I had had, of kind of warnings of safety and danger. And so Russell Targ's work really spoke out to me. So that's what led me on the path. He was one of the cookie crumbs.
And, this is UFO channels to some degree. We talk a lot about contact.
Right.
Where did the UAP or UFO or contact equation come about in your story?
So I've never talked about this, which, I put a lot of thought into talking about it because I feel like it's so important for us, people in the experiencer community, to share our stories, because I didn't share my experience for a long time. One of the first people I shared it with was the person I mentioned was Grant Cameron. Yeah. He reached out to me actually because I had reached out to him, but we had missed each other for like a year. And then I spoke with him privately and he kind of gave me the confidence really to speak up and stop just, being in isolation. But what happened was my daughter and I were traveling from Alaska, where we lived, down to Oregon because she was going to school, to college. And we left in our truck and I stopped over in Livingston, Montana, because I had some friends there. And we stayed in Livingston for a few days. And then we drove over from Livingston, Montana to Medford, Oregon, because she was going to be going to school in Ashland. And we left late at night and we left from Livingston. I mean, we didn't leave at night. We left in the day, but it takes a while to drive from Livingston over to Ashland. And as we were driving down this highway, which is a small highway from, basically after you pass over from Idaho into Oregon down south, and then you cut over. We're driving. It is dark. It's probably like 8 at night. And she says, look at those fireworks in the sky. And we had been driving for hours at this point, and so I'm like, fireworks. And so I look under the visor trying to see what she sees. And she's like, yeah, there's like fireworks coming down and we're out in the middle of nowhere. And I was like, well, maybe it is. Maybe someone's having a party or whatever. Then I see it and it was almost like being hailed. That's the best way I can describe it. A light came over our truck and it went poof, 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 like a succession of 3 lights. And I thought it was maybe like military exercises or I don't know, but it didn't look like fireworks. It came right over us. And then I saw that and I went, oh my God, that's not fireworks. And she's like, no, it's not. Then one light dropped down, right? And then it hovered above the vehicle and I'm watching it driving at the same time, looking at it. And then it separated. It was a red, like an orange red light, and it separated into 2 orbs. So I was like, that's no military operation. Yeah. She's like, I don't know what that is. Because our minds were like trying to understand what was happening. And so often you hear that, when the light arrives or the craft arrives, your mind is trying to overlay with something that makes sense. Well, this didn't make any sense at all. And so when it split into 2, I said, well, you watch that one and I'm going to watch this one. And so my light went over to the side of the truck and I still was driving. I didn't stop. And it paced me. And then it started to go up and then it started to come down. It almost felt like it was toying with me because it was going fast and it was making maneuvers. It was going left to right and up and down and right angles that made no sense at all. Not like a military craft or any type of craft that I've ever seen before. And so then it dropped down close and it like went with me. And I was asking my daughter at the same time, well, what's happening on your side? And she's like, it's going up, it's going down, it's going up in the sky and looks like a star. And
Yeah.
so I knew at that point that something was going on. I either thought that it was some type of surveillance that the military was doing. Still at that point, I thought we might have gone into like a training exercise by accident. And then this is where it gets really weird. So you hear people talk about how it gets weird. It
Yeah.
goes from odd or abnormal to like really weird. So as I'm driving and watching this thing, making all these maneuvers in the sky, I see like a cloud, right? Alongside the road in the distance that I think might be a train. Steam, it's exhaust plume, right? And it's coming towards us. So I see this cloud and I'm like, wow, is that a train? And my daughter's like, I don't see a train. And I said, I don't see a train either, but it looks like there's a cloud. So we get closer to the cloud because we're driving towards it. And as we click close, I realize it's a dust plume. Either something has crashed or there's been an accident. And it's like, I see it in my perception as debris. So I pull over because as we get to where the dust cloud is, I see in my vision like a big like rock or hill with the dust cloud behind it. And so I pull over because on the other side of the road there is a car that stopped, and it's just two headlights. And so I think it's an accident. So I'm doing the Good Samaritan thing and I pull over off the highway. And it's kind of a hairpin turn and it goes up into a pass, which leads you over into Ashland, the backside of Ashland. And the town that's on the top of the pass is called Lakeview, Oregon. So I stop and I pull over. And my daughter's like, what are you doing? And it's silent. I open the door and it's silent. There's no sound. She's like, this isn't good. Don't get
Yeah.
out. Please don't get out of the truck, Mom. And I'm like, well, we need to help. There's obviously been a crash or there's something, we need to help out. There's nobody else out here. But the car that was in the other lane had the doors open and there was nobody in it. So she was like, if you get out, this is going to be a Fringe incident. That's what she said because we had just gotten done watching Fringe,
Yeah.
which I had heard about, but it was like, we were just binging it for fun. But she was like, no, this is a Fringe incident. And so I closed the door and I said, you're right. And I backed back in the truck. I turned around and I started to watch the mile markers where this crash had happened. We got back. I backtracked. I went all the way around to the next town, which was called Christmas Village. Look it up on the map in Oregon. It's a real, it's a real town. Yeah. And I stopped there and it was around 9 o'clock. And so they were shutting down the gas pumps, but there was a guy who was working inside and he came out and I asked him to use his phone. And he said, yeah. And his son was there with him waiting in the car for his dad to get off work. And I said, I need to call 911. So I did. I called 911. I reported the incident. They were basically like, that's hell and gone out there. There's nothing out there. And I was like, yeah, but I think there might be a crash. Please go and, help out. And she's like, okay. So she asked for all my information. And the son who was sitting in the car is listening to us as reporting it. And I said, there was some strange stuff in the sky. And the son said, did you see all that? And I was like, yes.
Oh,
And my daughter was like, we saw it. And he's like, there's an old military, base out there. And I was like, well, do you think that was the military? And he was like, no, I don't think so. And I said, I don't think so either. And so his dad was kind of looking at us like, we're these crazy chicks in the middle of the night, wanting to use my phone. But then that happened. And so I drove through the rest of the night and I got my daughter to her orientation at school. And then I was affected, profoundly affected by it. So I started to have a series of what I now understand are after effects from the sighting. And so, I had already had, as I explained, precognitions and other things before this happened, years and years worth of it that I had been researching and trying to understand. But when the sighting happened, it took things to a whole new level of consciousness that I was just profoundly affected. There were exaggerated psi experiences, exaggerated visionary experiences that were prophetic, that I couldn't explain. And so that's the short end of the story. That's kind of when I went, wow, another life-altering, reality-shattering experience.
Yeah, that's kind of like the UAP or the UFO connection to where, sometimes people look at them as completely separate things, but a lot of the time people actually they tend to experience not just one, but several of these different kind of like profound kind of subjects or experiences, if you will. So the after effects. Can you get a little more into that?
It was life changing. The after effects were life changing. So, as I've already kind of mentioned, one of my go to people is Grant Cameron. So, I started to try to understand what the heck is going on with me, because I had pretty exaggerated effects before with psychic phenomenon that I had pretty much felt like they were well understood in my own experiences. Like I could understand synchronicity. I understood telepathic connections with other people, like the need to call somebody and then they say, I'm thinking about you. But the after effects were a new level of consciousness, and consciousness as it relates to other individuals, but also in experience with the others. So after that happened, I immediately talked to my dad, because my dad was the only other person that I knew who had had a profound encounter. He was driving on near our farm. He was dating my mom at the time. And this was just kind of a story that we had in our family. But when I was little, I thought it was made up. Like I didn't really seriously take it seriously. I thought it might have been a joke. But then after my daughter and I saw the red lights in the sky and the way they maneuvered, then I started to reevaluate what is happening. And so I went to my dad and I told him what happened. And the first thing he asked me is, did the truck go dead? Did the truck go dead when you saw the lights? And I was like, no, the truck ran. And he said to me, when he was on Route 29 heading home from a date with my mom to go back to his parents' house, he had a light come over his car and his Corvair died. And so he was completely immobilized in the middle of the road where we were still able to travel. And so I said, well, that's interesting. And not only that, right, that my dad had had an experience seeing the lights, and now I and my daughter had had experience seeing the lights. My dad and I had had an experience when, after I stopped the fire in that apartment complex in Seattle where I had gone home to Pennsylvania for a visit. And he and I had a mutual telepathic experience happen where we had an intuition to go back to our old house. And when we got there, we realized it was a mutual intuition that we had had together about danger, and it was validated. So I knew that he and I had that psychic telepathic connection because we had experienced it together before 20 years ago. But when he told me about his Corvair being stopped by the lights, I thought there might be another connection genetically. Yeah. I still leave that open, what that could be, that genetic connection between my dad having those experiences, then his daughter and his granddaughter having them, 20 years later. But I thought at that point, this is another connection that we have genetically, that not only do we have intuition and telepathic stuff in our family, but we were experiencers as well. And so that was pretty profound and in a way, because it felt like things were coming together. And so then I kind of had to recast all those other earlier experiences of the fire and the warnings and, the telepathic feeling and synchronicities to others, that maybe we were experiencers all along and we just didn't know it.
Yeah.
And so when I put those pieces together, of course, I started to talk to my daughter. And she saw more lights in Oregon with her boyfriend, where she saw a whole series of lights above a mountain, and the way they turned, it looked like it was one object, a huge object. She described it kind of like a mothership of lights going over the mountain slowly in Medford. And then my other younger children and I had other experiences where we saw other lights in Anchorage, Alaska. And so then I started to go, Grant Cameron's stuff makes sense, right? Because if you get to Grant Cameron's YouTube channel and you watch all the stuff that's going on there, you're like, wow, this is, a wide range of topics. But then I saw through all those different testimonials from different people that we kind of fit into that spectrum.
Yeah.
And understood it in a new way. My daughter didn't want to talk about her after effects for many years, where I was like trying to dig it up at the time while it was happening. So there's 2 or 3 more experiences that came about that were, to me, after effects that couldn't be denied. One was I was at home in Pennsylvania visiting, and it was almost like it was an altered state, right? But I was sleeping, but I woke up from it, but I wasn't awake. So it's another one of those weird things where it was almost like somnambulism, but I wasn't walking around. But in the wake cycle between sleeping and waking, I saw another bunch of lights above, hovering above the house where I was sleeping. And I woke up and thought, okay, this is another level of reality that I'm experiencing once again. But it was to the point where it was like I was awake, but I wasn't awake, and I saw the lights. So it wasn't just lights, it was like a craft. And so I
Yeah.
documented that, wrote it all out. And then another one was when I came back to Alaska, there was another lucid dream, but it was more than lucid. It was like being connected to another reality where a portal opened up in the wall of my room. And I've never talked about this. And there was blue, purple lights in the portal in my room. And then there were these beings that came through. And my dad was there. My dad has passed away now, but he was there. So he was like in the afterlife. I was there, and these beings were coming through, and they were reaching through, and they were communicating telepathically. And so that was an after effect that
Yeah.
was couldn't be described as anything else but an after effect after seeing the lights. And then there's successive things along the way. But then after I read Kevin Day's testimonial about what happened on the Nimitz, he described the same type of after effects where there's like prophetic imagery. And then there was the other link, which was basically the BICS paper. I basically downloaded through one of these after effects what I wrote about in the BICS paper, which is essentially the psychic language that we all
Yeah.
speak, that we've forgotten about. So I've been given like those answers. And so it took me a while to integrate all those different experiences and not feel completely bonkers.
Yeah. That's exactly what
Bonkers.
I was going to say was that, did those experiences inform your paper for the BICS Institute, or, in a way, because it's not just that, you're intellectually researching it, you've also experienced it to some degree.
Right. Right. So backtrack to before we saw the craft. At the same time, there was a parallel process happening where I was kind of following a calling, I would say, which was more spiritual. But it also can't be a separate process, right? Because they're
Right.
interwoven. So I was going through like spiritual training where I was working with a teacher, and she was teaching me how to go to these different levels of reality. And, she was brought about totally like, I feel like through that calling process. So I was already doing training, which I would call like spiritual teacher training of how to understand those different levels of reality. Now, when I went to my teacher and I told her about what happened, she just basically said, good luck with that. Good luck with understanding that. Good luck with trying to figure it out. Like, she didn't want to have anything to do with it. But when I was under that spiritual training and trying to understand the lucid dreams and trying to take it to the next level as a teacher, there was a download that came from that, which was a vision that went into science, the new science that's coming in the future, right? Which was basically like another type of prophecy. My role in that science and what I'm supposed to do and how it works, and it was phenomenal, right? So that was happening. Then we see the craft, then the after effects happen. And so it's been a long like continuum that I've been trying to unravel this whole time. And so I put the UAP part of that in one category and the spiritual part in another category, and they overlap in interesting ways. But when I had the vision going through the spiritual work that I was doing, or the inner work, it's totally connected to the UAP part of it. Because
Yeah.
the beings that basically like came through the wall through that after effect, the lucid dreaming of the after effect, I'm relating them to the same beings that I saw when I was going through my spiritual training. And they basically gave me similar information about, learning, psychic phenomenon, communication, how we communicate, what communication means. And so that's what the BICS paper essentially like describes, is all those visionary experiences with all that information that I've been given from the
Yeah.
beings. I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of it's from my own soul as well. It's not just, kind of being handed to me, but it's kind of like, this is what your purpose is. Go do the work. stop delaying. Because that's what the consistent message is, like stop resting or stop being idle. Now I'm always busy with the stuff, but I hadn't really stepped out and claimed it like I am these days,
Yeah.
including the UAP part of it, because I've never really included that before and been open about it.
Yeah, and I'm honored that you're coming on here and sharing that. And yeah, I mean, for me as well, it's I had similar processes as far as spiritual awakening, and then it could be seen as separate, but I had it's really the same thing to me, where you have the UAP thing or the UFO experiences, contact sightings, psychic phenomenon, synchronicities, and they kind of meld together into one thing, I think, especially if you take a kind of meta perspective, right? And you
Absolutely.
see the whole, you see it as a whole, um, as a process of awakening of some sort. We can call it that. And there was a few things about your paper I wanted to discuss,
Okay.
and just for people listening, I guess the subtitle is "Signs, Symbols, and Messages from the Afterlife." Where do the signs and symbols play into this part of intuition?
Well, it came in because I feel like the message doesn't always come in concrete. So I had a lot of really great teachers over the years, and they have taught me how to conceptualize what's going on with the intuitive part, because it's so rare in our culture now that you get taught, especially in the school setting, like about our intuition, about these types of communication. And so since communication is the overarching thing of my paper, what I basically tried to do is explain communication doesn't just come through concrete, which means you get the message, it's explained clearly, you get it, and then it's going to happen in reality, right? Like the precognition that I talked about through my own lucid dream. A lot of times that's not the way it comes through. It doesn't come through as completely explained to you as you can understand. It comes through different types of metaphorical content from your own subconscious, which
Yeah,
goes into psychology, it goes into narrative psychology, it goes into transpersonal psychology, right? And the way people perceive reality through their own perception. So the paper is designed to talk about communication, but not in the literal sense of the way you and I are verbally communicating. It goes into communication in a way that is the way a lot of us experiences, which is symbolic, metaphorical communication. And for, the caveat that I'm talking about under is highly sensitive people, right? So it gets even more specialized the way the paper is presented. But everybody has symbolic communication through our dreams, through the
yeah,
way that we perceive our society, through our culture, through the mythologies. So I break it out into signs, which are more like synchronistic signs that experiencers often have, signs that they feel are leading them, right, to a certain direction or a certain type of person. And so I really feel like it was warranted to talk about the signs, the symbols, and the messages, because afterlife messages come through symbols to the perceiver a lot of times. But if you're not paying attention to it, you miss it. And so it has to come again and again and again till the perceiver recognize, oh, this is a message from the afterlife. And so once you become attuned to the way those signs, symbols, and messages come through, you can see the subtle differences between them. So that's what the paper intended to do, was explain the subtle differences and the nuances in those types of communication, and then how to perceive it.
yeah. And I thought it was really cool that part of the title is called "The Language of Consciousness." I thought that was very apt. And even in my own experience, I've experienced different levels of communication in that sense. But one thing that's been constant is like impressions, is what
Right.
I've called it. Is I'll have an impression of something, and it seems like the communication is in some ways just below the level of consciousness, and you have to kind of vibe to get it.
Absolutely.
There's a whole part of it that where the tricky part is the integration, right?
Right.
Integrating it. So I think that's something that is very interesting. And and again, to integrate, like if you're somebody who you feel like you get a download, it might take you like some weeks to really integrate that download. I mean, sometimes it could be instantly, but sometimes like you have that I guess, again, a download or something, and it will take you, weeks or even longer to integrate it. And you're like, that's what that was, right?
Years sometimes, right?
Yeah,
Years. I mean,
yes,
I can tell you like linearly the timeline of those events that I just described to you, like the prophetic vision of the new science, right? Which sounds completely grandiose and so far out. But that happened in like 2014. My daughter and I see The Craft in 2015, just a year later. Then the after effects are like 2016, 2017, 2018. And I still didn't understand that first visionary download of this is the way it is. And it was so huge and so massive in the way that it was delivered that I struggled. Like when it came in at the time, I was like, this is the answer. This is the answer to the universe. This is the answer to human development. This is the answer to star seeds. This is the answer to the way these people perceive. And I had it, right? And I felt like I was given this great gift. But then you go into material reality, right? And the actual reality of the events that transpire, and it feels like it's taking millennia
yeah,
to work it out and to understand, how does this fit in? How do I make this happen? And that the download is 100% true. But the thing that happens when you start to read through the literature, right, of all these experiencers who are given the answer, or they get mathematical formulas or whatever, is that reality and time is slower in the physical reality. And so you have to keep those visions in your heart and recognize them as true, but know that they might not come to fruition right away. You're being given something very precious, and it's your responsibility to tend it, whatever way that means in terms of tending it in your life. So I've never forgotten it. I think the exciting thing for me was I had the opportunity to explain that gift in the BICS paper, which so many
yeah,
people don't get that opportunity. I mean, you see experiencers write books, they talk about their own personal experience, but to be able actually to put it into the arena, and say, in the scientific arena, and say, well, this is what I've come up with, and to be judged by a group of your peers is, I mean, it's nerve-wracking and it's maddening, but it's still like a great achievement.
yeah. And you've mentioned After Effects a few times, and there's a lot of really cool stuff in the BICS paper. And you mentioned that you had an encounter or conversation with Dr. Gary Nolan.
Yes.
So how did that come into your work?
I saw your release of the talk that he did at Harvard Medical School on the study, like the science. And so when I saw that, it felt to me like having a mirage, right, on the horizon, and then it kind of coming into form. And so when I saw that in that excellent blog post that you did, I was like, this is it. It's coming. The new science, the vision that I had, I was like, it's coming into reality, right? Things are starting to materialize. So I reached out to him because I was writing 4 Gifts of the Highly Sensitive, and I wanted him to go on the record about intuition, because I had a whole chapter about intuition, how people experience it, how the gifted highly sensitive person will experience it in their perception. And he went on the record. He talked about the study. We talked personally about his work and experiencers specifically, because he was basically like, how did you get into this? And he's another person like Grant Cameron, who I told privately, well, and he was like, we had so many experiences that were so similar. He was like, okay. And I think that, told him that he could trust me, with the information, and, that I could put it in the book, and that he would be able to be on the record in a positive way. And so that's your blog led me to him. And then I talked with him, and then he validated my work for the BICS study. So it was
That's so
it was a
interconnected.
totally
Yeah,
synchronistic chain of events, but I see that chain clearly connected, almost like a chain reaction.
yeah. That's incredible, right? The interconnected component
Yeah.
of it is how all that formed out into that. That's incredible.
Yeah. So he and I
Um,
had this like high level discussion about, well, how does the intuition and the caudate putamen happen organically in the brain. And so we explored different things together. He shared with me the perspective that he was taking and his peers were taking about his study. And we talked about things like epigenetic changes and epigenetic markers and how they change. And, and I asked him a couple of thought-provoking questions to try to see if I could draw him out a little bit and if he would, theorize further about experiencers and that intuition. And, he really wouldn't, he wouldn't go to any like projective analysis about what it might mean for the future. But that was okay also, because he validated certain parts of it that I had been studying for a long time. So for me, it was 100% validation that new science is coming.
Yeah. Yeah. And he's working on a lot of different things. And, for people listening, they're going to know that he was working on materials with Jacques Vallée. And there's going to be a few interesting papers that come from that, and probably follow up on the CP.
Yeah.
That would be very interesting. Now, you had also mentioned in your paper, you've referenced the Vallée and Davis 6-layer model.
I think that's one of the most important papers that's been written in the field.
Yeah,
I've read it numerous times. I have, I've taken a break from it and then I've come back to it to see if I miss something, if I get something new out of it because I'm looking at it differently. And so I directly cite their paper because it validates my own hypothesis with the afterlife communication. Because their framework is basically saying, I'm talking in generalities, right? The overarching thing in their paper is like from these studies that we've done with the metamaterials, with the experiencers, with all these different caveats, they're basically saying, don't take human ideas and overlay them onto the experiences and anthropomorphize, right? To take a human ideology and say, this thing is going to behave as if we would, because we don't know what it is, whether it's ultra terrestrial, whether it's cryptid, whether it's the, extraterrestrial, right? Because they're not putting any values really on this is what it is. They're saying this framework shows us that it behaves in this way and this is how it affects, right? So it's that after effect piece. So I read it. And then when I was designing my own study with highly sensitive people, also some people who are experiencers, one of the trends I started to see was, well, if Jacques Vallée and Eric Davis are talking about not anthropomorphizing, if human consciousness does survive and goes on to a next level of existence, it would make sense that you could use the same hypothesis that they use in their paper to describe the thought structures that human consciousness works through. That's essentially what I'm basically turning around and putting back out, saying we can rely on this because since we've been through human experience and we rely on our own thought structures for communication, human afterlife consciousness would communicate through a human thought structure. That's essentially what I'm contending. And I'm using the backbone of their research to kind of flip the anthropomorphizing on its head and say, well, we can anthropomorphize because we're human and we use human consciousness. And so we've had that experience, that lived experience, if that makes sense. That's a lot,
sure.
But that's essentially what I tried to do.
Yeah, I think people here will hopefully, even if they don't, let's say, get it right away, it will plant the seed for deeper.
Well, you have to think about it like, why do experiencers who see craft or lights in the sky also see people who are passed away?
Yeah.
Right? Why are they communicating with the dead? Which there's an overlap there between people who have psychic experiences, people who have seen craft or have seen lights, and then the afterlife component, which is kind of an underpinning that most people don't connect. But when you read Whitley Strieber's book about Anne and his wife and his longtime companion, when they were receiving all the letters from the experiencers who had seen lights in the sky, Anne pointed out to him, this has something to do with the afterlife and people who have passed away. And so once again, for me, it was more validation reading that she was picking up that pattern while she was, still alive and receiving all this testimonials and stories saying, well, I saw my father or I saw my relative, but I've also seen lights. And so it's no coincidence that people who have had experiences of the phenomenon also see individuals or hear from them or feel that they're around because they're using similar types of psychic faculties.
Yeah. And I believe my friend Axel Academian did an episode on that.
Oh, really? Okay, I'll have
I
to go
think he
check it
did.
out.
I think he
Okay.
did. I believe he did.
Anything that
Um,
I can do, he can do better. That's
no, yeah,
the
I love his stuff. I love it the way he breaks things down. Um, but also you in the paper you mentioned something called intuitive soul language.
right. That was what was given to me in a download years before. Years
Okay.
before we saw the lights, years before I started to do the spiritual training part of my own inner work. I had a download. I was sitting in the car's parking lot, which is a grocery store in Alaska, and my daughter, my oldest daughter, once again was with me, and I went to get out and like do the grocery shopping list, and I just had this huge vision. But it was also like the same type of thing I've described, hearing a voice with all this information. So I made her like get like an old bill envelope out of my purse, and I'm like, transcribe this. It's intuitive. It's the soul language. And so she's writing everything down, and I'm telling her everything that's coming to me because it's all coming so fast, right? In that download, but I don't want to miss it.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
like the clearness and the clarity of it and the granularity of it when I go into the grocery store because it's so massive. So she wrote everything down on the envelope for me, and that is where I go, into the paper with BICS and describe what that download was and all these subsequent experiences that led me down to certain paths in the research, like transliminality, different types of intuition, anomalous cognition. And so I kind of take that download and then wrap it all up with the BICS paper, the
Yeah.
different facets of it over the last that download has been 10 years ago now with the intuitive soul language. And so I describe it as we all have it, right? Because we're human, and if the soul exists through different reincarnations and through an afterlife, that language is always there. And it comes through the intuitive means. It's not logical. It's an intuitive process, and it's your soul communicating. That's
Yeah.
essentially what I'm saying.
Yeah. And you also mentioned in the paper that, the way that people perceive the information, right? So let's just say if the information is, or, it's just information, but we're kind
Right.
of intuiting it,
Hmm.
and it's going to come through a filter of our beliefs to some extent.
Right. Yeah, and so everybody has different beliefs. I think the most fascinating thing about my own personal story that I've shared is that I didn't have any education in any of this. I didn't have a religious belief system. I didn't have, I mean, if I had a system, it came about through psychology, really, which was like linear at that time when I learned it, and there was no allowance for any of these other things. So what opened up for me totally intuitively through this intuitive process, I've had to understand through my own experience and putting it together that way. I didn't have a belief system, but from knowing about people having their own belief system and interacting with other people who are deeply religious and trying to look at these situations and look at the way this information comes through, I understood that their dogma would not allow it.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I did research and I did go to every different type of church and spoke with my friends about what was happening, and they were like, this isn't allowed. You either have to admit that this is God working through you, and I was like, well, can it just be human potential? And they're like,
Yeah.
no, it's God. And so that's the
Yeah.
part that gets really difficult for me, is the belief system filtering, because when you start to talk about a lot of these experiences, I've just basically been told and have lost friends over it that this is demonic.
Oh
And
man.
so
Wow.
my reconciliation with that part of it is that how can it be demonic when it's saving lives? How can it
Yeah.
be demonic when it's warning me of these criminal people? Or, I mean, it just never seemed demonic to me because it was always beautiful and warning and loving and encouraging. And so to me, it was never demonic. I didn't have
Yeah.
that as part of my paradigm or my belief system. But when you start to listen to all the people who are coming out talking about the government programs and why all of this has been kept under wraps, you start to make the connections that that is real. That religiosity is real. And so a lot of this is going to come back up, and there's going to be a resurgence because they're talking about Skinwalker now, and it's hitting critical mass where Skinwalker is a big part of this shift and this paradigm shift in consciousness. And there's a lot of fear-based belief systems around that. And so it's going to be triggered. That fear system is going to be triggered again through that disclosure, essentially, of what Skinwalker really is.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, they shut down the OSAP program partially because of that whole, theme of, oh, it's demonic. We shouldn't be looking there.
Well,
Um,
when you look at the book, and I just downloaded the new book that just got released that everybody's talking about, right? And I'm reading it, and I'm trying to read it from complete neutrality, not be looking at it for my own personal vested interest. I'm just trying to read it as a reader would read it who's picking it up for the first time. And if you're looking at it, it looks scary. You mean
yeah,
I mean, I'm to the part now in the chapter where they're actually talking about people being, for lack of a better word, and I'm just being honest, infected.
yeah,
Families, and then those people come in contact with other people. And if they're sensitive enough, then they become, part of the phenomenon. And so that's scary.
the Hitchhiker Effect. Yeah,
That's
yeah,
scary. I mean, if you look at that and you're coming from it and not having had any experiences like we have and become accustomed to it and attuned to the way, the impressions or the promptings or the synchronicities come up. I mean, the best example of this is Kevin Day when he talked about his after effects, and he was having these prophetic visions that were like astrological, which are
yeah,
literally the spiritual warfare on the planet. It's not a far leap. It's not a far cry to going back to that religiosity and going, okay, there really is a warfare. Now, Jacques Vallée cautions all of us to say, hey, these belief systems and structures that are in place are coloring everything that you're perceiving and picking up. So what's the truth? And so he talks a lot about his perspective of the deception, right? And what part of it is deceptive because the beings don't always tell the truth. And so you have to have the discernment as an experiencer to be able to perceive a lot of what's going on and not internalize it and get torn apart by it. Because I have to say, when the exaggerated after effects were happening to me, it was difficult. It was so difficult. I mean, I could really relate to Kevin Day's being in Medford, living in the trailer, having lost a lot of different things in his life, and just dealing with the after effects. Because it kind of becomes a full-time job at that point. And he was worried, right? Because he's like, look, if this experience is happening to all these other people who aren't prepared for it, he was basically saying, I'm worried for society. Because if they don't have meditative processes or a spirituality or something really grounding, it can lead to madness. And so that's where I think Skinwalker can be a little fear-inducing. If you don't have
yeah,
that history of knowing you're going to be okay through writing out whatever it is, the
yeah,
phenomenon or the UAP or the dreams, you're okay.
yeah. Because I mean, when you're in the thick of it, when you're going through it, it's so surreal. It's
It's
so,
intense.
yeah, it's intense, and if and it's very easy to lose your grounding. Um,
And to
and
believe in things that, you have no proof for, and to
yeah,
get caught up into the community. Because once you start to seek out information, there's all these people in the community, right, that are proselytizing about the end or what it's going to be or disclosure, right? Getting caught up in the disclosure machine. And that can really take you off base from being centered
yeah, and
and
for
finding
me,
and finding coherence with yourself and what you're perceiving.
yeah, yeah, and for me, meditation was very important in grounding and kind of like almost like a vipassana or investigation and really questioning and trying to detach myself in a way, not in a dissociative way, but being able to take a step back and just look at it as, for what it is rather than what you're assuming it is.
Right. It's a
Because
slippery slope. I mean, that
yeah,
is such a slippery slope because if you've been in experience since you've been a child, and then you start to look at all the information that's out there in the field about people who have experienced this stuff since they've been a child, a lot of times it's coupled with trauma.
Yeah.
and traumatic experiences, and sometimes really complex trauma. And so, if you don't find that meditation practice, it's easy to dissociate, or it's easy to get stuck in the hypervigilance aspect of it,
Yeah.
of fear, right? And so, the way PTSD has its symptomology, there's so many fine nuances in finding your own truth and not getting caught into the delusion, right? I mean, you hear Joe Rogan all the time lambasting the field of experiencers and calling us all schizophrenics. I mean, I heard that recently on one of his podcasts, is like, all those people are schizophrenics. And I took a major like shot when I heard it, because I was like, well, we're not all schizophrenic.
Yeah.
You know, we're all trying to sort out what this reality means for us. And consciousness is the one, constant value in all of these experiences, whether it incorporates PTSD or not. And so the slippery slope comes in finding what works for me as an experiencer, because it's hard not to want information all the time and continue to feel like you're hungry for more, which can be an obsessive, unending need, right? Which is almost like an addiction as an experiencer, because that downtime that you have in reality waiting for that vision, it can just be a drain. It could just be a black hole where it just sucks you down into it, like a vortex almost. So that's why when I was talking with Dr. Gary Nolan, that's one of the things I said. It's like, I have to take steps back from all this stuff, because I feel like I
Yeah.
can get sucked into that vortex. And now with the way disclosure is coming about, it's easy to get hooked back in and lose your balance and lose your
Yeah.
peace and your tranquility. And just know that it's not all about the information. It's about you taking care of yourself as well and not getting hooked in, and recognizing that's all just for show. Really.
Yeah.
The news, the CBS, all of that is just entertainment of people waiting for the next drip, and it's addictive. It can be very addictive.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important to have the grounding of some sort. Um, and we're seeing a lot play out now in the media, and you almost don't know which direction it's going to go in. But you got the guy at NASA, saying these things like, oh, he's kind of saying, oh, it's probably not drones, or it's probably not anything else, but we live in such a vast universe, so it almost seems to some extent they're trying to condition people to like expect the unknown in a way.
I feel like it's such a matrix of media conditioning, government conditioning. There's even, to some extent, if you listen to Jacques Vallée talk about the experiencer phenomenon, there's even an intelligence conditioning, where the intelligence is conditioning us on a whole nother level. And so all those different signals happening at the same time, meditation is key to maintain your own cognizance, your own perception, to be able to tease out the difference between the false stuff and what's true. And the inner wisdom, I feel, will always lead you to what's true in the reality,
Yeah.
because there's so much conditioning on so many levels. That's what I love about some of the things that I've talked about, the experiences that I've talked about today, because they're truth. They're 100% unadulterated truth, like the stopping of the fire, or the download about intuitive soul language. Those kind of things to me are like my inner truth guiding me along the way, saying, don't buy in to what's out there, which is
Yeah.
basically, the play or the theatrical stuff. And a lot of times our society right now is totally hooked into the outer. And so those pieces of wisdom that I've gotten give me the confidence to know there's an inner part of this that's truth in that wisdom. And the BICS paper was 100% about trying to bring that about in the message, the signs, the symbols, the communication that we receive, those kind of things. The one reason that I write about it is because you find truth through it. You find truth through those messages, not necessarily the UAP phenomenon sometimes, but with the afterlife phenomenon, it's truthful if you get evidence for what's
Yeah.
being conveyed. And if there's evidence of what's being conveyed, that can only be through the experiencer and the afterlife personality, which is hard to prove.
Yeah.
That's hard to
Yeah.
prove and test.
Uh, I think I heard it on Ryan Bledsoe's podcast. Bledsoe said so. He said that somewhere Diana Pasulka had said that people who are intuitive or if I want to use the term psychic,
Hmm.
um, psychic people have a filter that filters them towards truth.
Well, it seems to be the case that the intuition leads you. It leads you on a path, and that path could be described, especially with a lot of the downloads that people talk about, to a path of truth, because it parts the waters in a way for the intuitive, purely intuitive, to come through. And like, once again, there's the overlay, there's the cognitive values like you hear about in remote viewing that kind of take the signal off, right? And your brain tries to make sense of it. But if you're purely intuitive knowing leads you, it's almost to a path of truth. I would
Yeah.
100% agree with that. As long as you're keeping it pure as you possibly can without the cognitive overlay. And only the people that are like completely intuitively perceiving can understand that. Otherwise, this just sounds like
Well,
gobbledygook.
and no, and I think too, I mean, my own experience, the meditation, in my experience, has been very helpful in that discernment with and trying to part away the cognitive overlays and seeing what it is for what it is, without the mind trying to overinterpret it what that's supposed to mean rather than what it actually is.
Do you want to have another example?
Yeah.
I'll give you another example. So I was going through my yoga teacher training once again in Anchorage. I'm in Anchorage, and I'm going through the teacher training, and we're getting the teachings from our teacher. She's talking about asanas, but we also meditate, and we go through this whole process throughout the day. And all of a sudden, it's in the afternoon, it's after lunch. I start to feel and see in my, it's like what you're talking about with the impressions. I call it like butterflies. I feel like it's
Yeah.
butterflies that kind of show up on my shoulder. Like, it's not actual butterflies, but it's like this fluttering of
Yeah.
information.
Yeah.
Like if you're thinking about conscious and unconscious, it like pops through
Yeah.
in
Yeah. Yeah.
this slightly subtle way. I started to see, I'm in class, right? I'm being taught to, so I'm taking information.
Yeah.
But on the side, I hear this name of an individual who used to be a former like personal trainer of mine, right? And I'm like, wow, that's interesting. So I just put it to the side, but then it comes back again. Then it comes back again. Then I kind of see her in my imagination and I'm like, what is going on? Why am I thinking about this person? I'm serious. A half hour later, she walks by the studio outside the window from
Yeah.
from next door, because there was a restaurant next door to the yoga studio.
Yeah.
And I see her and I'm like, oh my God, I just had a real time intuition and then it was confirmed. So I go to
Yeah.
my yoga teacher afterwards and I'm like, can you believe this? And I heard it, and then I see her walk and she was like, no, I can't believe it. And I was like, well, that's something, isn't
That's
it?
so
And she was
weird.
like,
Yeah.
it's just, she's like, we know you're receptive. She's like, you're
Yeah.
being receptive. But for me, it was like real time proof.
Yeah. Yeah. For
And
sure.
so that's kind of how I describe it. That's a truth, right? Because I'm thinking about her while I'm in the yoga class and then I see her. And so I didn't know if it was a telepathic thing where I'm picking up on her and she's in the other space. And so I'm
Yeah.
like, remote viewing her real time.
Yeah.
But then I don't know what basket to put it in, but that's a classic example of the proof or the truth. You
Yeah.
get validation.
Yeah, and there's sometime it's like I don't know if this is like a telepathic phenomenon or precognitive, um, but there's been a few times in my experience where I had like a dream, and I have a video I did called Dream Time Contact, which is a good example.
Hmm.
But where I had this dream and then I ended up having a sighting in broad daylight right after that. But another example is that I was actually on
Wow.
a CE5 retreat, right? And I was doing the meditation and the CE5 protocols at that point. This is back in 2011. and I received the impression, I see it and I hear triangle, and
Oh,
the reason why this was cool is because it was one of those examples where I was like, triangle. I'm like, what is that? What is that supposed to mean? So I said, I'm just gonna leave it alone.
yeah.
I'm not gonna judge it. I'm not gonna try to to frame what it means or anything. I'm just gonna let it be triangle. So we go out, and as soon as we get to the field site, within 2 minutes, there's a perfect triangle of lights in the skies, like a
Wow.
perfect equilateral triangle of these golden orbs, which we call flash bulbs, blipping in and out. And it was there for 10 minutes. Gold anomalous lights in a perfect triangle. And I was like, that's what it was. I get it, because
Yes.
I didn't try to interpret what that means. And that's, and again, it was in real time,
But
kind
I
of,
think it's so great that we're talking about it because it's like this is why the label experiencer is so accurate
yeah,
because it's a bunch of experiences and it's hard not to get caught up in the labeling of what it is and trying to figure it out. I mean, that's like my biggest
yeah,
handcuffing because I'm always trying to figure out and label what it is. But when it comes through pure like that, and then it's validated immediately, you don't have to wait a long time for like the precog. The precog is
yeah.
almost real time. I mean, that's phenomenal.
Part of,
But
yeah,
that's how it works for
yeah, yeah.
experiencers.
Part of my own, I guess you can say, coping mechanism, right? Or maybe even something meditation taught me, is the sense of patience, where when something comes in, I kind of have a trusting, like, I know this is a significant thing. I'm going to wait, and I know it's going to unveil itself. I know it's going
Right.
to come through.
The problem, I think, especially for people who are really like fast processors, I mean, there's different styles. So that's what the other thing I didn't necessarily do with the paper, but I talk about it elsewhere is like processing styles, where you have people who are getting all this sensory information, right? But it's different for everybody. So you have some people who are really auditory, so they hear stuff, and then you have some people that's sentient, so it's a feeling sense.
Yeah,
So everybody's different, right, in their processing style. But then you have some people who are perceiving an expanded states and they're processing a huge amount of information. And so then it's like, how do you document all of that? So I used to be hung up for a long time on just documenting all of it, and it was like volumes of synchronicities because I was trying to tease out, well, what's synchronicity, what's real, what's false, what am I making up? And that took me many years. And then eventually I started to be able to tease out, okay, I really need to document this because I'm probably going to lose half of it through waking time
right.
or
Yeah,
real
yeah,
time, right? And so I really wanted to document the important piece. I don't document so much anymore. I kind of do what you do and just let it settle and know that it has meaning and I'm going to know that meaning. But then there's other things, especially coming out of lucid dreams, that I document because
yeah,
I might forget it when I call it like the amnesia. It's like amnesia of the real time or the waking time takes away some of the information.
yeah. With
And so
dreams, especially.
sometimes I just feel 100% compelled to document it because I don't want to lose it, especially if there was something important.
Yeah, dreams are especially tricky. If you don't jot it down, like as soon as you wake up, it's tough to have that. Yeah,
Yeah. And
there's
here's
something
another
about that.
effect
Yeah,
that I think is really cool, which requires a little bit of documentation, is if two experiencers are connected together, say in the same family. Let's just say it's a family related experiencer where they have experiences or they're distant. Like my daughter is distant from me now. So she'll have an experience and then she'll tell me about it. Sometimes I'll document those too, because it's almost like she's perceiving information for herself, but also for me.
yeah,
And so she's going to feed me back a signal that she picked up in her dream time. And then I'll document that because I didn't have it, but I know it's important.
yeah,
So almost like omens, or she's getting an answer before I'm even anticipating it. And that's the other really cool part about families and the genetics and all of that coming to play because your kids will tell you stuff that they're getting. And so I live in a house where I put them around the table in the morning and that's open where we talk about it. Well, what did you dream about? Oh, I had this or that. I've had another hypothesis for a while now that families have like a family psyche.
Yeah.
An interconnected nucleus or a web of familial psychic phenomenon where there's an interplay off one another, or you'll have a question and then your kid will answer it for you because they're totally in tune and open.
I think that should be part of your book when you put together.
I've talked about it a little bit, and people are like, "Please do this.
Yeah.
Please go forward with that." I've just been at kind of like the nebulous stage with that, with the familial psyche,
Yeah.
but I've seen it with
Yeah.
my kids as evidence, and so that's where it came from. Is that I would ask myself a question before I go to sleep at night, and one of the kids would answer it at the breakfast table, and I would be like, "Oh, that's cool. That's a cool
Yeah.
effect." So I don't know it, but it's something definitely worth exploring. Other people have talked about it or written about it, but their books are out of print and it's like $50 to $70. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
haven't read anybody else's stuff because it's expensive.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
maybe
And some
you're
of
right.
those.
Maybe I need to write my own theory on that.
Well, no, I was gonna say, I think if if you end up turning the BICS paper into part of a book, which I hope the BICS paper becomes available, because it's so awesome. It really
There is
is.
some really great stuff in there. I talk about transliminality. I talk about that porous boundary that experiencers have where the communication is more ripe, right?
Yeah.
Because the internal receptivity and the way that experiencers have the phenomenon come to them. And so those things would be nice if it does get published. I mean, I will definitely parlay the paper into a book if it doesn't, because I
Yeah.
feel like it's pretty valid and it's valuable, especially the afterlife piece.
Yeah. I thought all of it was great. And getting to the end of it, you had a questionnaire.
Yeah.
Uh, so can you go over the questionnaire a little bit for people? Because I think that's even a helpful tool for people.
It is. And there's other questionnaires that are out there in parapsychology that they use for certain types of experiences, like transpersonal experiences, atypical phenomenon. And I took from multiple questionnaires to kind of develop my own, which could be seen as positive or negative, right? Depending on the research group analyzing it to tell if it's going to have validity. But I did my own. And so one of the things through all the either expert testimony or through the experiencers that I found was it was lineage, right? A lot of the people who had these experiences, it was in their family. So I start with lineage. I actually kind of went into genealogy a little bit
Yeah.
as part of the narrative questionnaire. So people could talk about their parents, their grandparents, what descendancy, and if they saw the phenomenon in their family line. And a lot of them said yes, it was in
Yeah.
the family line. So that's kind of where I started, was with family origin. Then I went into if they went through the questionnaire and had an out of body experience, saw an ancestor in the afterlife, whether in a dream or through some kind of contact, if they said yes to those, then they got funneled into the more narrative interviews. So that's where I probably need to back up and explain. If they answered yes to a series of questions on the afterlife questionnaire, then they got put into the narrative part of the study. And those
Yeah.
questions were drawn from other questionnaires that I had analyzed. Have you had out of body experience? Have you had contact from an ancestor? Have you had lucid dreams or precognitive dreams? And so when they said yes, then they got funneled into the narratives. And then I would have interviews with individuals completely privately so that they could be open about what they'd experienced. But yeah,
Yeah.
the questionnaire is what the funnel was to whether they would be able to get selected or not into the wider interview process.
Yeah. And you mentioned it here a few times, and I just wanted to ask you, um, you mentioned a few times the new sciences, right?
Yeah.
So that is fascinating. And people will probably have an idea of what that means, but when you're saying that, what do you mean about that?
It's a combination of new technologies that will be able to explain old, very old, ancient gifts or abilities. That's how I conceive of it, because we haven't had the technology to really test and show consistent effects like precognition, telepathy, these individuals are being tested now, and they're finding that technological evidence that there is an effect, a neurological or neuroanatomical change that was there over time or through trauma or through inheritance. And so I feel like the new science that's coming about, which this came about through the vision, it was actually called the new science, by this, being I was communicating with, that the new science was going to be able to explain a lot of it, but also enhance the abilities to a point where we would be using them in society and we would be open about it and it would be completely accepted. And I have a feeling that that's coming. So, new technologies that explain with science old gifts or old abilities that have been passed down through families to children that we're now able to detect and
Yeah.
nurture. It'll be a nurturing of those abilities in a new way, in a new light. That's the new
That's
science.
that's got to be either like a subtitle or part of the title or one of the big parts of the book.
My family makes fun
Definitely.
of me because I'm always like, that's the new science. And they're like, the new science, mom. And so, they're always talking about like science fiction. And I'm like, well, science fiction eventually is becoming science fact now. So we
Yeah.
might as well just call it the new science. So that's why I've been described as a bridge writer, somebody who
Oh,
bridges,
yeah.
as somebody who bridges the new science explaining things that have always been there, like clairsentience, clairvoyance, the knowings, the things that have been new age for a long time. The new science will now be able to explain those things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's just an eventuality, um, that all this stuff that might even seem, I don't want to use the term magic, but like anything that seems uh paranormal in a sense, anything that's super normal, I think is eventually going to just be explained through science. It's just a matter of time. We're going to understand all these different things.
And
Um,
miracles, right? And
yeah,
miracles
yeah.
too. Like magic
Healing, yeah,
has that charge on it that's like
yeah,
witchcraft. And so it's hard not to get hung up on magic, even though the purity of magic exactly is what you're talking about, right? But
yeah,
it's if you start to blend it with other things like more neutral or positive, like miracles happening,
yeah,
that's how it's been described. Well, that's miraculous. I mean, that's how it was always described to me when I would explain some of these far out stories, but the proof would be in the miracle or the
yeah,
or the warning or whatever it was. People would say, well, that's a miracle, that's
yeah,
miraculous. And I'm like, but it's not. Like, I'm
yeah,
like,
yeah,
there's obviously like this clear progression that's been happening the whole time. And then there's other people that just say that's not true.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, I have been negated and whatever. And so that's why I try not to step too far out of my own experience, because I know that I'm speaking with my own truth of
yeah,
my own experiences. And that's why I don't really talk about them that much, especially the UAP. I've never talked about until
yeah,
now, because people just, it's too far out and they
yeah,
can't conceive of it until it happens to them. Once it happens to you, then it opens up this whole new perspective and you want to know and you're thirsty
yeah. Well,
to know
and again,
more.
yeah, that's one of the reasons I really like the UFO subject and UAP, other than having experienced it, is that, yeah, it really brings all this together, like the physics and metaphysics, because you have these physical objects seemingly performing, metaphysical feats of, appearing, disappearing,
Yes.
telepathy, downloads. So I think, and right now, we're kind of experiencing the UFO collectively with everything that's being put out there, about the ATIP program and
Oh, I know.
UAPs and the public acknowledgement of it. Um, I think it's almost like experiencing the UFO or UAP on a collective level now.
Well,
And
and that is something that is, it's an evolution, right? And so that could have been, this could be happening the whole time. I mean, you hear Tom DeLonge talk about the cargo cults, right? About
yeah,
the guys who are on the island and then stuff just drops from the sky and then the local people create a religion out of it. And so
yeah,
there are some people that talk about this in a really enlightened way, that say, well, this might have been happening the whole time with human civilization,
Yeah.
and we don't know who the they are, but they certainly are shaping it. I mean, Jacques Vallée talks about that in his work. They are certainly shaping it towards a certain direction. And so it's a matter of taking all those disparate pieces. But just as one interesting point to what you're saying is, there's a guy that I interviewed for the BICS paper who was an astrophysicist, but he was also Jungian. So he talked about the
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
UFO,
Yeah.
right? And so Terence McKenna always also talks about the UFO experience in the same way. Where is it like, and it gets really heady, okay, but go with me. They say in similar ways, Terence McKenna was like, well, maybe it's the Earth, right? Maybe it's more like a Gaia hypothesis where these certain individuals are seeing craft or objects, and it's the Earth, right? Symbolizing that Earth or Gaia. And then this other guy who was a Jungian was sending me all this information about the UFO being part of the collective
Yeah.
unconscious.
Yeah.
And that the UFOs appear, and then he perceived it or he categorized it as a way that it's some part of ourselves that we've not, right, that we haven't integrated. And so there is some part of that that also makes sense to me. But then there's that additional piece that you and I talked about before we came on. It's material.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
material. It's not just ethereal. It's not just psychological. I mean, there are psychological effects, but it's also material and it's physical. And so that's why you see people in these silos who are really interested in the nuts and bolts and the physical. I mean, I hadn't spoken out about the UAP thing that happened with me and my daughter because I wanted to sort it out first, but I did go to like a secret UFO meeting in Anchorage. And I have
Yeah.
to tell you, I just showed up, right? And I sat down at the table with these individuals because it was a publicly announced meeting for MUFON here. And so I went and I sat down, and nobody had had an experience at the table except one person. And so then I just broke the ice, and I was like, well, this is what happened. And it was so interesting because this is my first time talking about it. The MUFON researcher said, well, I would like to just go back and go out in the field and see what really happened. And I was like, I'm
Yeah.
telling you what really happened. And she's like, well, yeah, you're an experiencer. And there was like this stigma
Yeah.
associated. Now, I'd never told my story openly except to my family. And I was like, rude.
Yeah.
Like I'm telling you, we saw stuff and there was an effect and then there was these after effects. So I walked away from that going, I don't know if I'll ever mention this ever again. Now, of course I did. I talked to Grant about it in private, and Grant was like, they are very nuts and bolts right now. He's like, you have to understand that they're about the investigations and what happens on the ground, but there's this whole other life that the experiencer lives afterwards. And he helped me. And so Grant, in my opinion, is a great luminary who is out there providing safe space for experiencers to find and kind of land. So that was my experience anyway, from the MUFON thing to talking with somebody who was a researcher for a long time. He was like, you're the people that they need to study as the experiencer. So I mentioned that in the paper too. I threw a bone out for Grant in that paper, like the experiencers are the people that we need to be studying because they're kind of on the front end of that curve. Whatever is developing, they're perceiving it in advance and detecting it.
Yeah. Yeah. And the MUFON kind of approach is very like cold case, like they don't even entertain as much as I think they should have. You have something like CE5 where people can go out and create an event and document it in real time. Why wouldn't
Right.
you put that, like, maybe if that's not your main focus, just put it out there, and why don't you have a research team dedicated to that? It really doesn't, I mean, it could be a volunteer basis, team that does that. And I don't know why they're
Yeah.
not more into that.
Yeah, it was
Um,
almost like a forensic post-operative clinical cold
yeah,
delivery that she had, and I was just taken by it.
yeah,
That it was like, okay, you're not even going to consider this as real. Okay, I get it.
yeah,
There was a couple other people at the table that were like, did that really happen? And I was like, yeah, it really happened, and I called it into 911. I mean, I never heard anything about it. So then the investigator said, well, I would be interesting to go back there and see if it was like satellites or what it is you saw. And I was like, it came down. You know, it split in two. It was, and so it's just nice to be able to be open about it because, it really did happen and we did call it
Yeah.
in and, we didn't become some, antidote of something horribly going wrong. I mean, we backtracked and we did the responsible thing, but there were after effects from it. That's the most important piece, that it's like you can have something like that happen and then there is a hitchhiker effect. It is
Yeah.
important to recognize it and then to document and know that you're not alone. I mean, when I read Kevin Day's testimonial, I was like, I can 100% relate to what he's saying.
Yeah.
Being concerned about the visions you have and the information you're getting and other people being affected by it. I mean, I think that's why the Skinwalker stuff is going to be so prescient now, because they're
Yeah.
really going to start pushing the narrative that this thing is not just contained at Skinwalker. It has
Yeah.
the ability to morph and shift and change and affect people. And so I think that's one of the big reasons why there hasn't been a big disclosure effort, is because the fear surrounding that hitchhiker effect and how people adapt to that or don't do well with it. It can be
Yeah.
psychologically like decoupling and unmoor you if you're not well versed in meditation, or have a strong sense of identity and have had these experiences and lived through them and know you're going to be fine. It can
Yeah. And
really,
then,
it can be fear inducing. That's all.
yeah. And just like you, I mean, it was hard for me to even tell of, my experiences to close friends. And, I remember one time I was trying to tell a close friend about this one experience I had, and the experience I had, other people witnessed too. I'll say my people, my whole family saw the event. Um, and I was telling him that and he was interested in meditation, spirituality, UFOs, but this was something like, I, you know, when I explained it to him, I could see the look on his face going in different directions. Like maybe he's probably exaggerating. Like I can see his process going on of
Yeah.
trying to cope with what I was explaining not being literal when it absolutely was. And it was absolutely witnessed by 3, 4 other people. Um, and again, this is a close friend of mine who's open-minded. Um, but
But it's triggering. And I've often wondered about the triggering. I mean, you have to be like synthesizing and sifting through a lot of this stuff. But one of the things that I picked up recently when I was listening to the filmmaker talking about his story about how he got into doing documentaries about sightings and the cover up and the government secrecy, essentially, is the Fox.
yeah, James Fox.
So James Fox, I didn't know who he was, and so I was listening to like these old interviews of him talking about how he got into it, and it was because somebody told him about it. He
Yeah,
wasn't an experiencer. Somebody told him about Roswell, and he couldn't accept it. He had
yeah,
that same response like your friend did, where he was like, "We're buddies, but I think I have to like separate from you now because that's going too far." But then it opens up this whole world for him where he eventually becomes a documentary filmmaker for,
yeah.
Roswell,
Well,
essentially. And so it can be, I think, triggering for some people where it's like that PTSD effect where they might have something in their background and they're just not ready for it.
well,
I mean, the
that,
way I can describe it is like when John Mack's book came out, and it was called Fire in the Sky. It was something that I had or somebody gave me, and I was in Montana and I got it and I looked at it, and it was so triggering when I got into it about the Travis Walton story that I was like, I had to put it down and I couldn't read it. And so I wonder if some of these exposures that people get to it, they just can't accept, is because maybe they've had experiences and they don't want to accept it. I think there's some part of that. I don't know for sure, but it's too triggering maybe. So they have to keep other people at arm's length that have had those
yeah.
experiences.
Well, I have to say, in my friend's, to his account,
In his defense,
in his defense, well, no, because it came to be that, he didn't write me off. He was just, I could just see what was going on in his mind.
yeah,
Like, but so he entertained what I was talking about, and he came out on some CE5s. And after a number of them, we had one experience with about maybe 25 people. where we had this golden craft come in really, really, really low over the group, and you have the golden light shining down on the whole group and everything, and it was
Wow.
incredible. And that was the event that like was the transforming one
The
for him, where
galvanizing.
yeah, like there was no question in his mind at that point that this was real, like, it was a reality, and he was able to integrate it at that point.
Yeah, because
um
there's a contrast. There's a contrast between people who have these experiences, or maybe once or maybe twice, and it can be life transforming, but it like comes in waves. And so then there is this real time thing where you start to negate or doubt you even had that experience. And so it's kind of like a reminder that these experiences happen, even for the people who they've had happen. But then there's also people who've never had the experience. They're so far out. And so when I was talking with Gary Nolan, he was kind of laughing and we had a chuckle because he was like, well, I always talk about it when people start to tease me about the alien thing. He's like, I start like this. It's a soft entry of, well, when you're driving home sometime, do you think about somebody and then they call you when they get home? And they're like, well, yeah, that happens all the time. And he's like, well, that's one small example of, this whole field of things that happen to individuals. And so I thought that was a really nice way of conceiving it, because people can kind of relate to those small little things that they go, oh, but when you're talking about it as a magnitude of like, 100, where the gold craft is there with the shining light, or the angel shows up,
yeah,
then you get into like the belief systems and the shattering part, where you're like, okay, I
yeah,
really need to reconceive of reality. What is it?
yeah. And for me, I kind of love that part of it, I have to say, or I've grown to. At first it was kind of a little, it was not a little, it was very destabilizing at first. When I came to one part in my journey, it was very like, what is real, what is going on.
Right.
But once I got through and over that, and I guess continued to grow and integrate, I found it enriching and again more awakening and positive at that sense.
Right. And
um
you talk and you see that too about people that talk about it as a, like a traumatic experience.
yeah,
And
yeah,
then how it becomes something that really needs to be, worked through
yeah,
deeply.
yeah,
And so that's the part that I also think that is it can be stigmatizing, right? I mean, that's why people don't come out and talk about their stories, is because they have professional lives and they work, but they are affected,
yeah,
deeply affected by it. And so it would be nice to have an outlet to process the
yeah.
experiences without having
Well,
to just rely on, friends or family too much. It would be nice to have a community.
yeah, well, and I think that's why it's important that this information is shared, so people know, this is like a thing that happens, and um they can know that they're not alone in that sense, and this does happen, you
Well,
know.
I'm so grateful to all the people that have shared their stories so that I could listen, from a distance and compare and contrast my own experience. And that's why I decided to talk with you today, so that I could
Yeah,
share, because we need to share our stories and have a safety net, especially while things start to ramp up. If they do ramp up with disclosure, is you need to be able to hear different voices and different stories, because it is different for everybody. Some people see different types of things. I mean, I didn't know when I started to investigate my own situation that a lot of times it's not craft that people see, it's lights. And that's exactly
yeah,
what happened to us, And
yeah,
so, and then I also didn't know about the after effects until I heard Kevin Day's story on Skeptico. And then I started to investigate that. And it really opened up for me the fact that, all right, I'm experiencing something that other people do. I'm not mentally ill, because that's kind of where
yeah,
you go initially.
yeah,
Is like when
yeah,
you try to share with other people who aren't in the community and don't know, you don't get that comforting piece of like, well, you're experiencing something that happens afterwards. And
yeah.
and if you only have Skinwalker to reach to, it it could almost be a little bit like,
Yeah,
what's
what the
going to
hell is going
happen
on?
next, and
Yeah,
if and are my family going to be affected, and and or will I be hurting other people that I'm coming in contact with? I mean, you could really get into the dark place, but there's a really light place too. So it's nice to have diverse voices, being comforting.
yeah. Well, it's been fascinating talking with you. We've been sitting
Yes,
here
it
talking
has.
for a while. I could talk to you like all day and night for a long time. And yeah,
Road
again,
trip.
I'm really honored that you came on and you shared your experience and story here. And I'm looking forward to talking to you again sometime. Um, but do you have any parting words for the listeners?
Well, I think it's just to, if anything that's been instilled through our, you know, conversation, the thing that occurs to me just in ending and closing is that don't let people tell you that it's not true. Like I had experiences where I had people along the way tell me, well, like that doesn't happen, or that's, impossible. And so I just kept plodding forward slowly. And so the parting word is it's usually a string of things. It can be over the course of your lifetime. And, I wish I would have reached out, to people like Grant sooner. And so I think the message is reach out, right? Reach out to the people who are trustworthy, especially in the experience or community. I had a really good experience when I finally heard from Grant,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I think that those are the people that are there for a reason. They're
Yeah.
doing the work to let other people know you're part of something bigger. And so reach out sooner. Don't wait like I did for half a decade.
Yeah. And where can people find your work?
I'm online. It's Courtney Marchesani. I tell people, since you can't spell my name, I wrote the 4 gifts of the highly sensitive. That's easy to spell. It's easy to type into Google, and then you'll see a whole cascade of my work, my book, my website, the test. I have a sensitive test to find out what type of sensitivity gift you might have. So that's something that I offer for
Yeah.
people who are curious if they might be part of that spectrum. So yeah, that's easiest probably. 4 gifts
Yeah.
of the highly sensitive, and then I'll pop up. Because it's hard to spell my name, right?
It's not. I mean, for me, I thought that's what it was, but I wasn't sure. But yeah, that either works.
Or Inspired Potentials. Inspired Potentials is my website. That's
Okay.
another way to find me. And I'm on
Yeah.
Google that way, and I pop up first. So
Well, I'm gonna put all your links in the description so people
cool.
can click there. But just for people listening too on the podcast, so they know. And again, it's been great talking with you. I hope to
Thanks,
keep in touch
James.
with you
Well, and
and talk
thank
to you
you.
again
I
soon.
just want to tell people you were the person that you were kind of the linchpin person that had the information about the study, Dr. Nolan's study, that led me to finding the science. So listen to James. Watch for James. He's on the cutting edge. That's my
Well,
other
and I think
parting
that's all,
shot.
I think that's all kind of part of, experiencers um kind of being on the same page. So if there's an experience I hear that resonates to me, I reach out to them, I email them, I get in contact with them, and I do the morphic resonance thing.
Yeah, see, I didn't do that with anybody, but I did have the courage to reach out to you because I greatly respected what you did, and so that kind of brought us synergistically together for this. But that was years. That was years ago.
Yeah. Yeah. So
But it came to
again,
fruition, so hopefully, people will enjoy the conversation.
I
Thanks.
think they will. And I'll speak to you again soon. You take care.
Yes. Bye.
Bye.